My name is Holly Reeves, and I am 36 years old. On a Thursday evening in May, my mother hosted what she called a quiet family dinner at her house. 8 place settings on the dining room table, the good china, the candles she only used for Christmas. She had spent the morning making the lemon chicken she used to make when we were children, and she had bought a particular brand of wine my husband Daniel had once mentioned he liked. The guest of honor at this dinner was a woman named Megan Locke. Megan was 33 years old, had 2 small children, lived in a town about 300 miles away, and was, according to a legal document that had been filed in another state, my husband's wife. My mother had invited Megan to her home without telling me, without telling my husband, and without telling my husband's other wife, which is to say me, until the morning of the dinner, when she had texted me with a casual message that said, "Dinner at 7. Wear something nice? I have a surprise for you." I want you to know what I did when I read that text. I sat in my office. I read it twice. I forwarded it to my attorney, Patricia Marlowe. I waited for Patricia's reply, which came within 10 minutes and which read, simply, "Don't go." "I won't," I replied. Then I picked up my phone and made one phone call. By the time my mother was putting the lemon chicken in the oven that evening, the divorce papers were filed. The bigamy referral was with the district attorney in 2 states, and the financial discovery motion that would unravel 4 years of my husband's hidden life was on Patricia's desk, being prepared for the morning filing. This is how it happened. Wherever you are listening from, drop your city and the time in the comments. I really do want to know. To understand how my mother ended up hosting a welcome dinner for my husband's second wife, you have to understand the kind of woman my mother is. I love her. I want to be honest about that before I tell you the rest. She is not a cruel woman. She is not a stupid woman. She is something more specific than either of those, which is to say she is a woman who has spent her entire life believing that any problem can be smoothed over with enough composure and the right china. She is the woman in a community who hosts, the woman who knows everyone, the woman who handles things in the way that does not make a scene. Her entire identity, as long as I have known her, has been built around the management of difficult situations through her own particular version of grace. This had served her well in many situations, and it had failed her catastrophically in others. Her grace was not particularly interested in justice, it was interested in surfaces. As long as the surface of a family looked smooth, my mother could be at peace with what was happening underneath, and over the 62 years of her life she had developed a particular gift for not looking too closely at the underneath of anything. I had inherited some of her composure. I had not, I would come to understand, inherited her tolerance for unsmooth surfaces. I had spent my own adult life building a career and a marriage that I had believed were both built on solid ground. I worked as a marketing director at a healthcare company. I made good money. I had 2 children, Owen, who was 6, and Lila, who was 4. I lived in a 4-bedroom house in a suburb 30 minutes from where I had grown up. My husband Daniel worked in sales for a software company that I had always understood required him to travel. I had built a life that looked solid, and that, until the spring I turned 36, I had believed was solid. Daniel and I had been married for 8 years. I want to tell you about him the way I knew him, before I knew the rest. He was warm. He was funny. He remembered our anniversaries and bought thoughtful gifts and was, by every metric that mattered to me, a present and engaged father when he was home. He coached Owen's soccer team on the weekends he was in town. He cooked breakfast on Sundays. He brought me coffee every morning before he left for the office or the airport. He told me he loved me before he hung up the phone every single time he called from a hotel room somewhere. He traveled 3 weeks out of every 4. This had been the arrangement since the 2nd year of our marriage, when he had moved from a regional sales role into the national role that required the travel. I had agreed to it because the money had been substantial, and because Daniel had told me, repeatedly and convincingly, that he hated the travel and was working toward a role that would bring him home full-time. I had accepted this the way you accept things that come with people you love. I had managed the household. I had managed the children. I had managed my own career around the gap his travel left in our domestic life. and I had told myself that the partnership we had was a real one, just one that operated across more distance than other people's partnerships did. I am embarrassed to tell you now how completely I believed all of this, but I want to be honest about it because I think honesty matters here. I did not suspect, I did not check, I did not, over the 8 years of my marriage, ever once go looking for evidence that the man I had married was not the man he said he was. Daniel was warm and present when he was home. Daniel called when he was away. Daniel produced expense reports and travel itineraries that matched the company he worked for. I had no reason, on the surface, to look any further than the surface. The mistake I made, I would understand later, was assuming that warmth was the same thing as honesty. They are not the same thing. The most dangerous kinds of dishonest people are the warm ones. They are not warm because they are hiding nothing. They are warm because they are very good at managing the people they are hiding things from. The thing that broke the surface finally was a phone bill. It came in the mail on a Tuesday in April. A bill for a cell phone account that was not on my and Daniel's joint plan. The account was in Daniel's name, billed to an address I did not recognize in a town 300 miles away. I had not been looking for it. It had come because the carrier had defaulted to sending paper bills to the secondary address on the account, which was our shared home address, when the primary address had returned a previous month's bill as undeliverable. I want you to understand that the discovery was, in its first moment, completely accidental. I had been opening the mail at the kitchen counter while Lila ate a snack, and I had assumed for the first 30 seconds that I was looking at junk mail. Then I had read it more carefully and seen Daniel's name and realized I was looking at something else. I did not confront Daniel. I did not call him. I did not text him. I put the bill in a drawer in my home office, the drawer I keep tax documents in, and I went back to my day. I made dinner. I helped Owen with his homework. I gave Lila a bath. I put both children to bed. Then I sat in my home office for 4 hours, and I began to look. I am the kind of person who, once I have decided to look at something, will not stop looking until I understand what I am looking at. This is a quality that has served me in my career, and it served me that night, in the more personal investigation I had not previously thought to conduct. I logged into our shared accounts, the credit cards, the bank accounts, the investment accounts. The cell phone bill in the drawer had told me an address I did not recognize, and I used that address as my starting point. I cross-referenced it against transaction records. I found in our shared credit card statements charges that had occurred near that address that I had previously overlooked, or that had been described in ways that made them blend in. A grocery store charge here, a coffee shop charge there, a car repair I had no memory of, a small home improvement store charge for a brand of paint I did not own. Once I had the pattern, I could trace it backward. The charges near that town went back intermittently 3 to 4 years. There were never very many in any one month. There were just enough to be consistent. Daniel had been spending time in this town for at least 3 years, and probably 4, and I had never noticed because the charges had been small and varied and had blended into a busy life I had not been auditing. I want you to understand what I felt during the 4 hours I spent in that office. I did not feel rage. I did not feel grief. I felt the specific focused attention I bring to a particularly bad project at work, which is the attention of a person who has identified a problem and is now sequencing the steps required to solve it. The grief and the rage would come later. They would come at inconvenient moments over the next many months. But that night, in my home office, I was operating on something other than emotion. I was operating on the determination to know everything before I did anything, because I had been a marketing director long enough to understand that the difference between people who win difficult fights and people who lose them is usually the difference in how much they know before they begin the fight. Over the next 10 days, I taught myself everything I could about the man I had married. I requested every account statement going back 5 years. I pulled credit reports. I used the address from the phone bill to do basic public records research, the kind of research anyone can do but that most people never think to do, because most people are not in my situation. I found that Daniel had been listed on a residential lease at that address since approximately 4 years earlier. I found, by looking at vital records in that state, that there were birth certificates for 2 children, ages 3 and 1, that listed Daniel as the father. The mother on both birth certificates was named Megan Locke. I found that Daniel Reeves and Megan Locke had been issued a marriage license in their state 4 years earlier and had been married in a small ceremony shortly thereafter. The marriage was on the public record. Daniel was legally married to me in our state and legally married to Megan Locke in another. He was, in plain legal language, a bigamist. He had been a bigamist for 4 years. I would learn later that Megan had no idea about me. Megan thought Daniel was a man who worked in sales for a software company that required him to travel 3 weeks out of 4. Megan had built a life with Daniel based on the exact same set of facts I had built mine on, which is to say, a set of facts that was almost entirely a lie. I did not call Daniel during these 10 days. I did not change my behavior toward him. I made his coffee in the mornings he was home. I kissed him goodbye when he left. I let him kiss me goodnight when he was in town. I did this because I had not yet decided what to do and because I knew, from the work I do, that the most important thing in a fight like this was to control the timing of the disclosure. If Daniel found out I knew before I was ready to act, he would have time to move money, destroy evidence, and shape the narrative with his own attorney before I could even file. The advantage I had was that he did not know I had found him out, and I was going to keep that advantage until the moment I no longer needed it. I scheduled an appointment with Patricia Marlowe, a divorce attorney who had been recommended to me by a colleague years earlier, in a casual conversation I had filed away the way you file away things you hope you will never need. Patricia had been practicing family law for 30 years. She had handled cases like mine before. She was the kind of woman who, when I called her office and described in 2 sentences what was happening, had her assistant clear an appointment on her calendar for the following morning. I sat in Patricia's office on a Wednesday in late April. I had brought everything I had gathered: the phone bill, the credit card statements, the bank records, the marriage license from the other state, the birth certificates, the lease. I had organized it into a binder with labeled tabs because that is the kind of person I am, and because Patricia had asked me, when we had spoken on the phone, to bring whatever documentation I had. Patricia went through it carefully. She did not interrupt me. When I had finished walking her through what I had found, she set down her pen and she looked at me. She said, "This is a federal bigamy case with significant financial fraud components." She said the criminal piece would be referred to the district attorneys in both states and likely picked up by federal prosecutors because of the interstate wire fraud involved. She said the civil divorce would proceed on essentially uncontested grounds because Daniel could not credibly defend a marriage that had been entered into while he was already legally married to me. She said, however, that the timing of how I disclosed everything to Daniel and to the other parties involved was going to matter enormously. She said we needed to file before he knew anything was wrong. She drafted a plan. The filing would be ready within 10 business days. In the meantime, I would gather any additional information she requested, but I would change nothing in my external behavior. I would continue to live in my home with Daniel during his weeks of being home. I would continue to do everything I had been doing. I would simply, alongside it, be running the parallel process of preparing his life to end. I asked Patricia about the other wife. I asked what would happen to her. Patricia said Megan was, legally, also a victim of Daniel's fraud, because she had entered into the marriage believing Daniel was a single man. Patricia said in many cases like this, the 2 wives ended up working together once they both knew, because they had been deceived by the same person in parallel ways and because they often had financial interests that aligned more than they conflicted. Patricia said it would be my choice when and how to inform Megan, but she suggested doing it carefully and likely through legal counsel rather than directly. I left Patricia's office and I drove home and I made dinner for my children. Daniel was traveling. He was, I now understood, with Megan and their children. I made spaghetti. Owen told me about a fight he had had with another boy at school. Lila spilled her milk. I cleaned it up. I gave both children baths. I read 3 chapters of a book to Owen and 1 shorter book to Lila. I kissed them both goodnight. I went back downstairs and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I cried then. Not loudly, because the children were sleeping upstairs. Just quietly at the kitchen table for about 20 minutes. The grief was sitting on top of the rage, and the rage was sitting on top of a kind of bewildered humiliation. The specific humiliation of having spent 8 years believing in a man who had been building an entire other life behind my back. I had been a fool. The marketing director who could spot a budget variance from 20 pages away had been a fool in her own marriage for 4 years. I forgave myself for being a fool eventually. But that night I did not yet have the distance to forgive. I just cried at the kitchen table and let myself feel it. Then I dried my eyes and washed my face and went to bed. If you have ever had to keep functioning while you were unraveling, drop a comment. Stay with me. The next part is where it gets specific. I made one decision before I told my mother anything. I decided I was going to tell her, because she was my mother, and because I needed her to know that I was about to do something that would publicly upend our family. I did not tell her the day I found the phone bill. I did not tell her the day I met with Patricia. I told her 3 days before the filing was scheduled, on a Sunday afternoon, when I had brought the children over for a visit and had asked her, after the children had gone to play in the backyard, if we could talk in the kitchen. I told her what I had found. I told her in chronological order, the way I had organized it for Patricia, because telling it that way let me get through it without breaking down. I told her about the phone bill. I told her about the address. I told her about the credit card pattern. I told her about Megan. I told her about the children. I told her about the marriage license. I told her about Patricia and the filing and the criminal referral and the timing. My mother listened. She listened. And as I watched her listen, I could see her face moving through something. I had expected anger on my behalf. I had expected sadness. I had expected the warm clarity of a mother whose daughter has just told her that the family she had built is about to publicly collapse. What I saw instead, slowly, was something else. I saw the composure she had spent 62 years building beginning to organize itself around a different response than the one I had expected. When I finished, she said, "Oh, Holly." She said it in the tone she used when she had decided that what I had said required a careful response. She said she was so sorry I had been through this. Then she paused. She said she needed me to understand something. She said the children were what mattered. She said I needed to think very carefully before I did anything that would tear apart their lives. She said families like ours did not handle these things publicly. She said she was sure there was a way through this that did not involve the police and lawyers. I want you to know what it felt like to hear those words. I had come to my mother believing that my mother would understand. I had walked into that kitchen expecting to be held, in some emotional sense, by the woman who had raised me. Instead, I was being told, with the same warm grace she had used my entire life, that I needed to be reasonable about my husband's bigamy, that I needed to think of the children, that public consequences were uglier than private accommodations, that family, in my mother's specific definition of the word, was a thing that could be preserved through enough composure on the part of the woman who had been wronged. I did not argue with her. I had learned long ago that arguing with my mother about her version of grace was a category error, because her version of grace was not a position she had reached through reasoning and could not be changed through reasoning. It was the operating system her entire personality ran on. To argue with it would be to argue with her existence. I told her instead that I appreciated her perspective and that I would think about what she had said. I called the children in from the backyard. I gathered our things. I drove home. I called Patricia in the car and I told her about the conversation. Patricia said in her measured voice that mothers sometimes responded in unexpected ways, and that I should not let it shake my plan. I told her I would not. I told her I was, if anything, more sure now than I had been before that the plan was the right one. What I did not know, what neither Patricia nor I could have anticipated, was that my mother had spent the rest of that Sunday afternoon after I left her house, taking action of her own. She had decided, in the way that women like her sometimes decide things, that this situation required her hand. She had decided that the family needed to be preserved, and that she was the only one in the family who had the wisdom and the composure to preserve it. And she had decided, sometime over that Sunday evening, that the first step in preserving the family was to reach out to Megan Locke. I would learn all of this later. I would learn that my mother, who I had assumed knew almost nothing about the technology my generation took for granted, had used a search engine to find Megan Locke in the town 300 miles away. I would learn that she had sent Megan a message through a social media platform that introduced herself, identified herself as Daniel's mother-in-law, and told Megan that she had come into possession of certain information about their shared situation and that she would very much like to talk. I would learn that Megan, who at this point had no idea anyone existed in Daniel's life besides her, had been confused and alarmed and had agreed to a phone call. I would learn that my mother had told Megan on that phone call that, yes, Daniel was married to another woman, that woman was my mother's daughter, and that my mother believed there was a path forward for everyone, if cooler heads could come together to discuss it. I would learn that Megan, after the initial shock of the call, had become extraordinarily quiet on the line, that she had asked a single question. Does Holly know? My mother had said yes. Megan had asked another. Is she okay? My mother had said yes, she was managing. My mother had not told Megan that I was in active conversation with an attorney. My mother had not told Megan that the filing was 3 days away. My mother had told Megan instead that she would very much like to host a dinner at her home, where Megan could meet Holly, and Daniel could be confronted with the situation in a controlled environment, and that she thought, with the right facilitation, the family could find a way through this together. Megan, dazed and unmoored and trying to process the worst news she had ever received, had said she would think about it. My mother had not told me about any of this. My mother had spent the next 48 hours preparing for a dinner she believed she could host into reality. She had bought the wine. She had made the lemon chicken in advance. She had set the table with the good china. She had decided somewhere in her composed mind that the right setting and the right food and her own particular gift for facilitating could absorb my husband's 4 years of bigamy into a manageable family conversation and produce a result everyone could live with. I want to say this carefully. My mother did not do this because she was malicious. She did this because she genuinely believed, against all available evidence, that the right hostess could resolve any situation. She believed that the alternative, the lawyers and the police and the public collapse, was going to hurt me more than the controlled conversation she was offering. She thought she was helping me. She thought she was rescuing the family. She had not consulted me because she had calculated that if she had asked permission, she would not have received it, and she had decided to act first and explain later, which is what people like my mother do when they have decided they are right. I found out what she had done on the Thursday morning of the dinner. She had texted me that morning to let me know about the dinner at 7. Wear something nice. I have a surprise for you. I read the text, and I felt the floor of my understanding shift slightly, because the casualness of her tone was incompatible with anything innocent. I called her. I asked her what the surprise was. She said she did not want to ruin it. She said I needed to trust her. She said she had been doing some thinking and that she had taken a small initiative to help the family. I asked her directly if she had contacted Megan. She paused for a long moment. Then she said yes. She said she had reached out. She said Megan was a very polite young woman. She said Megan had agreed to come to dinner. She said Daniel would be there too. She said she had not told Daniel about the situation, but that she had asked him to come for dinner that evening. And he had agreed, because of course he had, because Daniel was a man who said yes to dinners my mother invited him to. She said all of this with the composed certainty of a woman who had decided she was right. I did not yell. I did not say what I was thinking. I told her calmly that I would consider it and let her know whether I would be attending. I hung up. I forwarded her text to Patricia. I sat in my office at work for 10 minutes thinking about what I was going to do. What I was going to do, I realized, was not be at that dinner. What I was going to do was let my mother's plan unfold without me. I was going to let Daniel walk into a dinner he did not know was a trap, where he would find Megan Locke at the table and discover, in front of my mother, that his two lives had been brought into the same room. And I was going to be, at exactly that moment, at Patricia's office, signing the divorce papers and authorizing the filing of the criminal referrals and the financial discovery motion that would do, over the following weeks and months, what my mother thought she could do over lemon chicken. I called Patricia. I told her I was ready to file that day. She said she could be ready by 4 in the afternoon. I told her I would be at her office at 4. I asked her if there was anything I needed to bring. She said no, she had everything. She just needed my signature. I went back to work for the rest of the morning. I had a marketing review at 1. I attended it and I participated in it, and nobody at that meeting would have known anything about what was happening in the rest of my life. This is one of the strange things about being an adult in a crisis, that the work continues, and that there is a kind of peace in the part of yourself that can still review a quarterly marketing budget while the rest of you is preparing to detonate your marriage. At 3:30 I left the office. I drove to Patricia's office. I arrived at 4. Patricia was ready. She walked me through the documents one more time. The divorce filing, the bigamy referral, which would go to the district attorneys in both my state and Megan's, the federal wire fraud referral, which would be filed with the FBI given the interstate nature of the deception, the emergency financial motion that would freeze our shared accounts pending the divorce proceedings to prevent Daniel from moving money once he realized what was happening, the temporary custody motion that would establish me as the primary custodial parent during the proceedings. I signed everything. It took 20 minutes. When I was finished, Patricia said, in her steady voice, that her office would file in the morning. She said the bigamy referral would be made by phone that evening. She said I should expect Daniel to be served at his home address within the next 2 business days, but that the financial freeze would be in effect by the time he was served. She asked me where I wanted to be when the news broke. I said I wanted to be at home with my children. I left Patricia's office at 4:40. I drove home. I picked up the children from my regular sitter. I took them home. I made them dinner. Pasta. Frozen vegetables. The simple version of dinner I made on the nights when I had run out of everything I was carrying. At 7 o'clock, the time my mother had told me the dinner would begin, I was on the couch with my children watching a movie. We were watching a Pixar film I had seen probably 20 times. Lila was on my lap. Owen was leaning against my side. I had my phone face down on the coffee table. I did not know exactly what was happening at my mother's house, but I had a general picture, and over the next several hours that picture would be filled in for me through a series of phone calls. The first call came at 7:17. It was my mother. I did not answer. She called again at 7:21. I did not answer that one either. The third call came at 7:34. It was Daniel. I did not answer. The fourth call, at 8:09, was a number I did not recognize. I sent it to voicemail. I would later learn it had been Megan, who had not had my number but had gotten it from my mother. Megan would call again the next morning and I would answer that one. The text messages, in the meantime, were arriving. My mother sent 7 over the course of the evening. The first was asking where I was. The second was asking me to please come. The third was telling me that Daniel had been served papers in the foyer of her home and was very upset. The fourth was telling me that Megan was crying in the kitchen. The fifth was telling me that this was not how she had wanted things to go. The sixth was asking me to please call her back. The seventh, sent at 9:47, was simply, "Holly, please." I did not call my mother that night. I put both children to bed. I turned off my phone. I went to sleep. I learned what had happened at the dinner over the next several days, partly from my mother and partly from Megan, who I would meet in person within 2 weeks. The dinner had begun normally, in the sense that everyone had arrived and sat down. My mother had introduced Megan as a friend whose situation she wanted to discuss with the family. Megan had been visibly nervous, my mother told me, but had been holding herself together. Daniel had walked in 20 minutes late, kissed my mother on the cheek, sat down at the table, looked across at Megan, and gone completely white. He had not until that moment known why Megan was at my mother's table. My mother had begun what she described as her facilitation. She had told Daniel that the family was aware of his situation and that they were going to discuss it as adults. She had told him that this kind of thing happened in families and that it could be resolved without ugliness if everyone cooperated. She had used phrases that, when she described them to me later, made me understand with a kind of cold clarity that my mother did not actually understand what bigamy was. She seemed to believe it was a complicated personal situation that could be smoothed over with conversation, rather than a federal crime. Daniel had begun to talk. He had begun to explain. He had begun to construct a version of events in which both his marriages were the result of misunderstandings, in which he had been trying to find a way to tell both of us, in which he loved both of us in different ways. My mother had nodded along to some of this. Megan had begun to cry. Then the doorbell had rung. My mother had answered it. A process server had been at the door. He had asked for Daniel Reeves. He had served Daniel with the divorce papers and the temporary restraining order on our shared accounts. Daniel had stood at my mother's front door reading the documents while my mother and Megan looked on. My mother had not known the papers were coming that night. I had not told her. Patricia had timed the service to coincide with the dinner because we had known by then that Daniel would be at my mother's address. This was not, I want to be clear, an accident. Patricia and I had discussed it at length. We had agreed that serving Daniel in front of my mother and Megan was the most efficient way to deliver the news to all three of them simultaneously and to make absolutely clear that the situation was no longer something my mother could facilitate. We had not warned Megan in advance because Megan was, at that point, not yet our ally. She was a victim of Daniel's. And we trusted Patricia's read of the situation that Megan would eventually understand, but we did not have a relationship with her yet, and we could not risk her telling Daniel. The papers Daniel had been served included the bigamy criminal referral in the documents. He had read that part. He had understood, standing in my mother's foyer, that he was about to face federal charges. He had also understood in the same minute that Megan was sitting at the dining room table 30 feet away and was about to find out, from those same papers, that she had been one of two wives. My mother told me later that Daniel had tried to run. He had not actually attempted to leave, but he had become visibly disoriented, had begun pacing, had begun making calls on his phone, had said several incoherent things to my mother. My mother had handled this the way my mother handles everything, which was by trying to host her way through it. She had asked everyone to sit back down. She had attempted to call me again. She had attempted to explain to Megan that she had not anticipated this development. Megan, by that point, had read enough of the papers Daniel had set down to understand that her marriage was not a marriage. She had stood up. She had gathered her purse. She had asked my mother for my address. My mother, in a moment of judgment I will not defend, had given it to her. Megan had not driven to my house. Megan had driven to the hotel she had been staying at on the way to the dinner, had sat in her car for a long time, and had called her own sister, who lived in Seattle, who had told her she needed to find a lawyer before she did anything else. Megan had been smart enough to listen. The next morning, Megan had called me and had introduced herself calmly, as the woman my mother had told her about, and had asked if we could talk. We talked that morning. The conversation lasted 90 minutes. I will not share most of it because most of it was private. But I will tell you that within the first 10 minutes, both of us had understood that we had each been deceived in nearly identical ways by the same man, and that within the first 30 minutes, both of us had understood that we had more to gain by cooperating than by being adversaries. By the end of the conversation, we had agreed to share information through our respective attorneys and to coordinate our financial discovery efforts so that we could both maximize the recovery of marital assets Daniel had been hiding. Daniel was arrested 2 days later. The federal charges came first because the wire fraud was the most easily provable element. The state bigamy charges followed within the week. Daniel's attorney attempted to negotiate, but there was nothing to negotiate. The evidence was overwhelming. 2 marriages, 2 sets of birth certificates, 4 years of financial transfers between the 2 households that established clear interstate wire fraud. 2 wives who had now joined forces and were cooperating fully with the prosecution. Daniel pled out within 4 months, and received a federal sentence of 46 months, plus an additional consecutive 12 months on the state bigamy charge. He is currently incarcerated. He will be in federal prison for a long time. He has not contacted me directly since the day he was served, which is a small mercy I have appreciated. The financial discovery process took 8 months. Megan and I, through our attorneys, located approximately $340,000 in marital assets Daniel had hidden across multiple accounts. The court ordered the assets divided between us. Megan and I each received roughly half. The amount was not life-changing for either of us, but it represented a recovery that neither of us would have achieved alone, and it represented a kind of cooperation between two women who had been set against each other by the same man and who had refused to remain set against each other. The children, Owen and Lila, have been the hardest part. They are 6 and 4. They love their father, who is the man they remember being warm and present when he was home. I have not told them about the bigamy or about Megan's children. I have told them, in age-appropriate language, that their father did something wrong, and that he has to be away for a long time. I have not denigrated him to them. They will understand more as they get older, and at that point I will tell them what they want to know. For now they need to be 6 and 4, and to have a stable life with one parent who is present, and I am doing my best to be that parent. Megan and her children, who are technically Owen and Lila's half-siblings, are in a complicated and gradual relationship with us. We have met a few times. The children have played together. We are not trying to construct a relationship faster than it can develop naturally, but we are also not pretending that what we share is nothing. We are figuring it out. It is one of the strange and unexpected good things that has come out of all of this, the relationship between Megan and me, and between our children. It is not a friendship in any straightforward sense. It is something more specific, the alliance of two women who survived the same betrayal, and who have decided, with some effort, that we will not let that betrayal define the rest of how we treat each other. That brings me to my mother. I did not speak to my mother for 9 months after the dinner. She called many times. She left many voicemails. She wrote me one letter that was 3 pages long and that I read once and put in a drawer. The letter said she was sorry. The letter said she had not understood what she was doing. The letter said she had thought she was helping. The letter said many things that I believed she genuinely felt, but that did not change what she had done. What she had done was make a decision about my life without my consent. She had decided on the basis of her own version of grace that she knew what was best for me and for my marriage and for my family, and she had acted on that decision in a way that put me in a position to be ambushed at her dinner table by the woman my husband had also married. She had done this with good intentions. The good intentions did not change the result. The good intentions did not change the fact that if I had walked into that dinner unprepared, the way she had planned, I would have been confronted with my entire life imploding in a setting my mother controlled, and I would have been expected to handle it with the same grace she had spent her whole life modeling for me. I would have been expected to manage the situation she had created with her facilitation. I would have been expected to be the kind of woman my mother was, the kind who absorbed and smoothed and accommodated. I am not that woman. I had not been that woman before the dinner, and I was even less that woman after. The dinner had given me, in a strange way, the clearest possible picture of my mother that I had ever had. She believed she could host her way through her daughter's husband's bigamy. She believed that the right facilitation could turn a federal crime into a family conversation. She believed that what mattered most was the surface of the family rather than the truth underneath it, and she was willing to put her own daughter in the path of a public catastrophe rather than allow that surface to break. I could not, after 9 months of thinking about it, find a way to reopen a relationship with the version of my mother who had organized that dinner. I tried. I read her letter again. I sat with my own feelings for a long time. I asked myself whether estranging from my mother was a permanent decision or a temporary one. I decided in the end that I did not yet know. I called her on a Sunday in February, and we talked for 45 minutes. The conversation was careful and small. She did not apologize again because she had already apologized in the letter. I did not bring up the dinner. We talked about the children and about her garden and about the small things mothers and daughters talk about when they are trying to find their way back to each other without committing to anything in particular. We have a relationship now. It is not the relationship we had before. She sees the children once a month. I do not invite her to my home, but I let her see them at hers. I do not bring her into the decisions of my life the way I used to. I do not share with her the things I used to share, because I have learned that what I tell my mother is not always information she can be trusted to hold. She is who she is. She is who she has always been. I have spent my entire life understanding her, and the understanding has now arrived at a place I did not previously want to go, which is the place where understanding does not require closeness. I can know who my mother is, and I can have a kind of relationship with her that reflects what I know, rather than the relationship I once had that depended on me not knowing. I have come to think of it like this. My mother is a person who lives on a particular floor of a building. She has lived on that floor her whole life. The floor is the floor of her composure and her hosting and her belief that she can manage anything with the right lemon chicken. I had spent the first 36 years of my life on that same floor, because she had raised me on it, and because I had not yet had a reason to leave. The dinner she hosted made me leave. I am now on a different floor of the building. I can take the elevator down to visit her sometimes. I cannot live there anymore. I had to build my own floor. I have built it. I am still building it. I think about the night of the dinner often. I think about myself on the couch with my children watching that Pixar movie. I think about my phone face down on the coffee table, while across town my mother was trying to facilitate her way through a federal crime. I think about the timing of it, the way my decision to file that afternoon had been the exact opposite of what my mother had wanted, and the exact right move for me. And I think about how rarely in life you get to make a decision that is so cleanly right. I think about the courage it had taken to not answer the phone, to trust my own judgment over my mother's, to trust Patricia's plan over my mother's improvisation, to trust the version of myself who had spent 10 days in her home office, quietly building a case over the version of myself who had spent 36 years deferring to her mother's grace. I think about Megan sometimes, too, about what she had been doing while I was watching the movie with my children, about how she had sat in her car at the hotel and called her sister, about how she had not, even in the worst hour of her life, lost her ability to do the right next thing. 2 women watching the same lies fall apart on the same night, both of us making the right calls without being able to see each other. That is the picture I keep coming back to. We had not yet been on the same team. We had not yet known each other. But we had each, separately, refused to be managed. We had each, separately, called the right person. We had each, separately, declined to be hosted into accommodating what we were not going to accommodate. That is what my mother had not understood about either of us. We were not the kind of women who could be facilitated. We were the kind of women who, when handed information about our own lives, used it. We were the kind of women who called attorneys. We were the kind of women who did the slow, careful work of documenting and gathering and preparing, and who, when the moment came, acted without hesitation and without apology. My mother had spent 62 years believing that grace was the most powerful force a woman could wield. I had spent 36 years watching her wield it, and I had come, finally, to the moment in my life where I had needed something else. I had needed information. I had needed action. I had needed to be the kind of woman who could refuse a dinner invitation and stay home with her children while her husband's life collapsed in another room she had decided not to be in. I had refused the invitation. I had stayed home. The Pixar movie had ended. The children had gone to bed. The world had rearranged itself overnight in the direction I had chosen, and I had been at peace in my own house when the rearrangement happened. That is the part I am most proud of, if I am being honest. Not the filing, not the recovery of the assets, not the federal charges. The part where I sat on my own couch with my own children and did not answer the phone. That's the story. And if this found you when you needed it, a like and a sub would be nice. I'll see you next time.